She thought she was just helping a hungry old man, until a convoy of military trucks rolled up, revealing the truth about who he really was. The neon sign outside Maggie's diner flickered against the dark Kentucky highway, casting a faint red glow over the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. It wasn't much, just a roadside pit stop off Interstate 65 in Bowling Green, Kentucky, where the coffee was strong, the pie was homemade, and the wooden floors creaked with every step. The kind of place that never made headlines, never saw much change, but always had a story to tell if you cared enough to listen. Caroline Monroe, 43, had been part of this place for almost 15 years. Her uniform, a faded blue dress with a starched white apron, fit like second skin by now. So did the hum of the kitchen, the rhythmic sizzle from the fryer, and the old country songs that played on loop from a jukebox that barely worked anymore. It was close to midnight. The crowd had thinned out like usual. A few truckers sat at the counter, nursing cups of black coffee as they stared blankly at the wall. Old Jimbo Harris was in his usual corner booth, stirring his chili in slow circles the same way he had every night for the past 6 years. Two high school kids shared a milkshake at a back table, giggling as they sneakily glanced down at their phones. And then, there he was. Caroline spotted him through the window, standing just outside the entrance under the flickering glow of the street lamp. His coat hung off his bony frame like it belonged to someone else entirely. The sleeves were torn, seams split. His boots were scuffed, nearly falling apart at the soles. His hands, weathered, rough, and lined from years of hard labor, or maybe war, trembled slightly as he counted the crumpled bills in his palm. She'd seen him before. Not often, but enough to remember. Always lingering. Always hesitating near the door, as though working up the courage to come inside. But he never quite crossed that line. Some nights he just walked away. Other nights, he stood there long enough to remind the world he still existed. Tonight, he stepped in. The door creaked open, and a gust of cold wind swept through the diner. The overhead lights flickered once. The old bell above the door let out a tired jingle. Caroline wiped her hands on her apron and walked over. "You coming in, or just gonna let all the heat out?" she asked, her voice light but her eyes watching him close. The man hesitated, then shuffled forward, slow. I was just looking," he said. His voice was gravelly, worn thin like an old dirt road. "You can look just fine from inside," she said, tilting her head toward an empty booth by the window. He glanced toward the counter where the truckers sat, then back at the door like he was still deciding whether to leave. Caroline didn't give him a chance. She grabbed a menu, brushed past him, and set it down on the table. "Sit," she said simply, and he did, slowly, his joints stiff, his shoulders hunched like he was bracing for something. He picked up the menu with careful hands, his cracked fingers pausing at the cheapest item on the list, the cup of soup and half sandwich combo. She could see the math happening behind his tired eyes, that silent calculation of what he could afford versus what he needed. "I'll just take the soup," he murmured, clearing his throat. "Potato, if you got it." Caroline didn't move. Instead, she crossed her arms and leaned her hip against the counter. "How about the sandwich, too?" He gave a dry chuckle. "Soup's fine." "Yeah, well, it's a slow night," she shrugged. "Kitchen's got to stay busy or Lou back there's going to start picking on me." The lie came easy. She turned before he could argue, leaning toward the kitchen window. "Lou, bowl of potato soup and turkey sandwich. Extra mustard," she called. Lou, who was as talkative as a stone, glanced at her, then gave a nod and got to work. The old man, Samuel Blake, she later learned, shifted in his seat. His hands folded and unfolded over the tabletop, his weathered fingers tracing faint lines in the wood grain. "I'll pay you back," he mumbled, almost ashamed. Caroline waved him off. "Don't worry about it." "No, really," he insisted. His pale blue eyes found hers, watery but steady. "Someday," she smiled. "Eat while it's hot." And just like that, a single act of kindness set something in motion no one could have seen coming. Samuel hesitated before picking up the spoon. His fingers hovered above the bowl, like he was afraid it would shatter his dignity. Caroline watched from behind the counter, pretending to wipe down an already clean glass. She knew that look, the quiet shame of someone who wasn't used to taking anything from anyone. But this wasn't charity. It was a meal. And meals weren't handouts. Meals were human. Lou slid the plate across the counter with his usual blank stare. Extra mustard, he grunted. Caroline picked it up and carried it over to Samuel before he could protest. He looked up at her, something flickering behind his eyes, gratitude. Maybe, or maybe something deeper. You didn't have to, he started. It's already made, she interrupted, sliding into the booth across from him. No sense letting good food go to waste. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at her like he was waiting for the catch. But there wasn't one. So he finally picked up the spoon and took his first bite. The diner carried on like it always did. Truckers grumbled about diesel prices. Jimbo stirred his chili. The kids argued over jukebox songs. But in that booth, something was happening. Samuel ate slowly, carefully, like each bite might be his last. He savored the sandwich, chewing with a purpose most people forgot over time. Between bites, he spoke. I used to stop here. Long time ago. Caroline raised an eyebrow. Back when I was driving, he said, his voice far away, like he was seeing something out the window no one else could. East Coast to Texas. Sometimes farther. She leaned back. Truck driver. Not always, he muttered. Drove rigs after the war. There it was. The war. She didn't ask which one. She didn't need to. His face said it all. Vietnam, probably. Maybe Gulf. But most likely Vietnam. The years had left their fingerprints on him, etched into the deep lines around his eyes and the constant motion of his hands, even when they were still. What made you stop driving? She asked. He set a spoon down. A bitter smile tugged at his mouth. Body gives out before the will does. She nodded. Ain't that the truth? The silence wasn't awkward. It was just there, a kind of understanding that didn't need words. Samuel finished his soup, folded his napkin neatly, like a man clinging to the routines that held his world together. Then he pulled a few crumpled bills from his pocket and placed them on the table. How much do I owe you? Caroline shook her head. Told you. It's on the house. He didn't like that. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened. I don't take charity, he said flatly. It's not charity, she replied. It's dinner. He exhaled sharply, staring down at the tabletop. I'll pay you back. Not worried about it. She stood, grabbing his empty bowl. But Samuel's eyes didn't let go. Someday, he said again, his voice heavier this time. I promise. She smiled. All right. Someday. He slid out of the booth with the stiffness of a man who had walked too many miles. Before he left, he met her gaze. Thank you, Miss Monroe. She frowned. She hadn't told him her last name. Before she could ask how he knew it, the bell above the door jingled. And he was gone. What she didn't know was that someday was coming a whole lot sooner than she thought.